Breaking news today. How to easily increase the impact of sanctions against Russia. If you whisper "trickbot" or "Conti," cybersecurity experts will run for cover. A group of Russian hackers used malware and ransomware to gain access to servers in the West and demand payment of at least $800 million in Bitcoin. 18 members of the hacker ring responsible for the attacks were sanctioned jointly by Britain and the United States in February and September. Both the hackers and Moscow took a hit from this move by Washington and London. Supporting the invasion of Ukraine, the trickbot Conti gang was likely given orders by Russian intelligence. Members of the syndicate are prevented from entering the United States or the United Kingdom, and their assets there are frozen, due to the sanctions. The EU has not imposed sanctions, however, so the hackers are free to operate within the EU. This is not a clerical error, despite appearances. There is no formal mechanism in place to ensure alignment between British and European measures, and London and Brussels have made sanctions decisions independently since Britain left the EU in 2020. Because of this, regulatory divergences have opened up, which is a nice way of saying sanctions loopholes, which Moscow and other bad actors can use to their advantage. Resuming British-EU cooperation on sanctions is long overdue, and the trickbot Conti gang is just one example of such abuse. Britain and the EU could deal a serious blow to the Kremlin by working together to close obvious sanctions loopholes. If you ask any Western official, they will tell you that the G7 countries' coordinated sanctions against Russia are going swimmingly. Theoretically, this could be correct. Western countries, including Britain, the United States, and the 27 members of the EU, froze roughly half of Russia's $640 billion in foreign exchange reserves in the early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The coordinated sanctions of the G7 and EU against Russian oil exports is yet another example of Western cooperation. However, in practice, such cooperation is the outlier, not the rule. When it comes to going after businesspeople with ties to the Kremlin and illegal groups that support the Russian military, Britain and the EU do not work well together. The obvious justifications for this include: while the British government would have you believe otherwise, it is still more difficult under British law to place someone under sanctions than it is under EU law to sanction wealthy Russians. While this may seem like an insurmountable barrier, there are actually three good arguments in favor of a unified stance on Russia sanctions. One is self-explanatory. The effectiveness of sanctions would be increased with joint British-EU designations. The effect of Western sanctions would be amplified with shared designations, and other like-minded allies, such as Canada, Australia, and Japan, might be compelled to impose similar measures on the same murky people or firms, as they would be barred from entering and operating from both Britain and the EU. Sanctions evasion schemes could be uncovered with the help of formalized information sharing between the United Kingdom and EU member states. Together, the United Kingdom and the European Union could put a stop to the criminal networks that are illegally supplying Russia's military with semiconductors in violation of Western export controls. Some of these companies are located in the United Kingdom and the European Union, while others can be found in China, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. Washington blacklisted 49 entities earlier this month for shipping semiconductors to Moscow. 3 of these businesses were based in the United Kingdom, Finland, and Germany. Taking concerted action against sanctions evasion makes sense from this vantage point. The United Kingdom and France, another EU member, are 2 of the few countries with the intelligence capabilities to identify companies evading sanctions. The second justification relates to business and economics. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many Western companies that remained in the country found themselves in a precarious position. Many multinational corporations have reported that, in addition to Moscow's controls, it is challenging to navigate the various sanctions regimes that have been imposed. Of course, it's possible that this is an attempt to deflect blame from the fact that some private companies have decided to remain in Russia. This debate would be rendered moot if UK and EU sanctions laws were more in sync, which might encourage some companies to leave the Russian market. A third consideration is that if a Republican were to become president in 2025 and radically alter U.S. sanctions policy toward Russia, pan-European collaboration on sanctions would be an effective preventative measure for Europeans to take. The danger is not imaginary. Former President Donald Trump, current Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and successful businessman Vivek Ramaswamy are just a few of the many Republican candidates who have openly argued that the United States should not back Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. That's why it would be bad news for Western sanctions policy toward Russia if any of these candidates were elected. Building a united British-European front on sanctions would be a great idea if Europeans are serious about their long-term commitment to Ukraine and Washington changes its attitude toward Moscow. A policy proposal's logical structure on paper is no guarantee of its success in implementation. However, the best ideas are often impractical because of their complexity, expense, or lack of support. The good news is that increased cooperation between sanctions bodies would likely prevent these pitfalls from occurring. To start, it would be easy to put into action. Prior to Brexit, the two sides collaborated frequently. Now, the necessary administrators on both sides have been put in place to adopt and implement sanctions. As an added perk, London's sanctions teams are the envy of their European competitors due to their abundance of experienced personnel and cutting-edge technology. Second, resuming collaboration on Russia-related sanctions requires negligible financial outlay. After regulations are passed, it is up to businesses to carry them out and pay the associated costs of conforming. As a result, the government does not have to engage in protracted budget negotiations because the sums at stake are small when it comes to designing and implementing sanctions programs. Also, no one is making any money on the battlefield. The United Kingdom and the European Union, EU, have become fierce economic competitors since Brexit, and sanctions are one of the few areas in which neither has any firms to promote in an effort to create jobs and raise fiscal revenues. Third, there is little chance of a political backlash because people aren't particularly interested in the details of sanctions. The specifics of sanctions, such as whether they are joint or unilateral, are rarely discussed outside of expert circles. The necessity of confronting Russia is also widely shared across Europe. Despite Russian claims to the contrary, majorities or pluralities in all European countries except one support economic and financial sanctions, according to a Bruegel poll from early 2023. These two considerations make increased cooperation between Britain and the EU on sanctions relatively non-controversial. To put it more bluntly, nobody cares about joint British-EU sanctions except for the affected individuals and businesses and, of course, the Kremlin. The ability of Russia to wage war against Ukraine has been hampered by Western sanctions. Therefore, it is imperative that allies prioritize ensuring the efficacy and predictability of these measures, not least to increase compliance and buy-in from the private sector. In short, this is why a closer working relationship between Britain and the EU on sanctions is warranted. Naturally, there is no magic solution that would make Moscow rethink its position on Ukraine. But any little bit helps, and working together more closely on sanctions could be an easy way to improve political ties on both sides of the English Channel.